12 years after my husband abandoned me and his autistic 5-year-old son, he walked into my lawyer's office demanding control of the $2.3 million Noah had earned from one painting. I was ready to surrender. Noah wasn't. It was 9:10 on a Monday morning, and the conference room at Margaret Bell's office was too cold. I remember that because my hands kept slipping around the paper coffee cup she had given me. Outside the windows, traffic crawled along North Meridian Street under a flat gray Indianapolis sky. Richard sat across from us beside a lawyer named Calvin Ross. From a distance, Richard's navy suit looked expensive. Up close, the sleeves stopped too high above his wrists, and the shoulders hung wider than his own. His hair was dyed almost black, though his beard had gone mostly gray. When he reached for his coffee, I noticed a faint tremor in his fingers. I hadn't seen him in person in almost 9 years. He looked older, so did I. The conference room glass reflected a woman with silver roots, tired eyes, and a cream blouse, pulling slightly across the middle. I had gained nearly 50 pounds since Richard left. Menopause, late dinners, stress, years of eating whatever was quickest between therapy appointments and second shifts. My knees hurt every time I stood up. Vanessa, according to the photographs she posted online, still wore fitted dresses and oversized sunglasses. For one ugly second, I felt like Richard had escaped into a polished life while I had absorbed every hard year he left behind. Then Calvin slid a stack of papers across the table. "My client is asking the court to review the validity of the adoption," he said. "Until that happens, we're requesting that the sale proceeds remain in escrow." Margaret didn't touch the documents. On what basis? Fraudulent inducement, lack of informed consent, possible financial exploitation of a vulnerable minor. I looked at Richard. He kept his expression solemn, almost fatherly. It would have been convincing if I hadn't known him. "You haven't spoken to Noah in years," I said. Richard folded his hands. "Because you made sure I couldn't." Noah sat to my right, near the window with his noise-reducing headphones resting around his neck. At 17, he was taller than Richard. Thin, narrow-shouldered, with brown hair that always fell over one eye no matter how often he pushed it back. He was looking at the court filing, not at his father, Calvin continued. They wanted the adoption reopened. They wanted a guardian ad litem appointed. They wanted the court to investigate whether I had pressured Noah into selling his painting, and whether I had mishandled his finances. Most of it was nonsense, but nonsense written on legal paper can still do damage. Margaret explained that the money would remain protected for now, but the dispute could delay Noah's college plans, his trust arrangements, and the exhibition contract. Richard knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just coming after the money, he was making Noah's future uncertain. My chest tightened. I leaned toward Margaret and lowered my voice. "Let him have it." She turned sharply. "Helen, I can't put Noah through this." My voice cracked, and I hated that Richard heard it. If giving him something makes it stop, then give him something. Noah closed the folder. "Don't," he said. The room went quiet. He looked at me, calm in that careful way he had when he had already arranged his thoughts. "Leave this to me." Richard gave a small laugh, not loud, just enough. I knew that laugh. It meant he thought someone had embarrassed themselves. 12 years earlier, Noah had been 5 years old and small enough to disappear under our kitchen table. His biological mother, Claire, died from a brain aneurysm when he was 3. I married Richard 18 months later. I never tried to replace her. Claire's photograph stayed in Noah's room. On her birthday, we made pancakes because Richard told me she had loved breakfast for dinner. I read Noah the letters she had written during her pregnancy, even though he usually wandered away halfway through. By kindergarten, it was clear Noah needed more support than the school was offering. He covered his ears when the bell rang. He ate only 4 foods. He could spend an hour lining up toy cars by shade, then panic if anyone moved one. He knew entire bus routes but couldn't answer when another child asked his name. After months of appointments, he was diagnosed with autism. Richard took the news badly. Not with tears, with irritation. Every therapy visit inconvenienced him. Every school meeting felt, to him, like an accusation. One evening, after Noah screamed for nearly 20 minutes because the grocery store had changed its lighting, Richard stood in the garage and said, "Our whole life revolves around him." I thought he was tired. I didn't understand yet that he was building himself an excuse. The affair came later, or maybe it had already started. I found restaurant charges in downtown Indianapolis, a hotel bill from Louisville, and messages from Vanessa that ended with little red hearts. Richard packed on a February morning before sunrise. He loaded the newer SUV while sleet tapped against the windows. Noah crawled under the kitchen table when he heard the suitcases bumping down the stairs. I stood by the counter in my robe and asked Richard whether he planned to say goodbye to his son. He glanced toward the table. "I can't spend the rest of my life arranging everything around him." Then he left. 6 months later, after missing support payments and canceling 2 scheduled visits, Richard asked Margaret to prepare adoption papers. If I adopted Noah, his parental rights would end. So would most of his obligations. Margaret warned me that Richard might regret the decision someday. Richard signed anyway. At a Chase Bank branch in Carmel, he initialed every page while Vanessa waited behind him holding the car keys. A bank employee notarized the final signature. He sent 2 birthday cards after that. The second one was 3 weeks late. I worked days as an elementary school art aide and evenings at Michael's. I postponed dental work, bought shoes only when the soles split, and learned which insurance representatives could be reasoned with and which ones required an appeal letter. Noah grew slowly. Then suddenly, he learned to make scrambled eggs, to ride one familiar bus route, to tell me I need quiet before panic took over. And he painted. At 9, he painted our kitchen ceiling after a winter leak. Every stain was there, every crack. But the perspective was strange. The whole room had been painted from floor level, beneath the kitchen table. A visiting art teacher studied it for nearly a minute. Then she looked at me and said, "He isn't painting what the room looked like." She pointed to the dark space under the chairs. People sometimes ask when I first realized Noah was extraordinary. The truth is, I didn't. I just thought he was finally finding a place where the world made sense. He never painted superheroes or dragons the way other kids did. He painted parking lots after rain, empty classrooms, bus stops, hallways, windows, ordinary places most people walked past without noticing. To Noah, buildings remembered things. When he was 11, I found him sitting on the curb outside our old grocery store with a sketchbook balanced on his knees. "What are you drawing?" I asked. He didn't look up. "The place where you waited." I frowned. "For what?" "For me." Only then did I recognize the angle. It was the bench outside the Kroger where I'd sat after my evening shift years earlier because I was too exhausted to drive home. Noah had been inside occupational therapy next door. I thought he'd been coloring with another child. Instead, he'd been watching me through the window. Later, when I looked at the finished painting, I realized something. He hadn't painted himself. He'd painted me, waiting. That was Noah. He noticed the people who stayed. By 16, Denise Ward, his instructor at the Indianapolis Art Center, had become one of the few people outside our family who understood him. "He doesn't paint buildings," she told me one afternoon. "He paints memory," I laughed. That sounds much nicer than what he'd say. What would Noah say? He'd probably say, "They're buildings." Denise laughed too. Exactly. She convinced Noah to enter one painting in a regional exhibition. He wasn't interested. He only agreed because she promised he wouldn't have to give a speech. The painting was called The House After He Left. It showed our old home in Carmel just before sunrise. The upstairs bedroom light glowed softly. A dark SUV was pulling away down the icy street. Through the kitchen window, barely visible, a woman knelt beside a little boy hiding under a table. No tears, no dramatic expressions, just distance. When Julian Marks, who owned one of Indianapolis's most respected contemporary galleries, saw it, he called Denise before the exhibition even ended. She phoned me that evening. "Helen," she said carefully, "I think someone wants to meet Noah." I honestly thought she meant a local collector, maybe a $5,000 sale, maybe 10, enough to help with college. Julian invited us to the gallery after closing hours so Noah wouldn't have to deal with crowds. He walked through the room quietly, stopping in front of the painting for nearly 5 minutes before speaking. "I'd like to represent this piece," he said. Noah looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I think someone will want to own it." Noah considered that. "But I already own it." Julian smiled. "I meant they'll want to buy it." Oh. That was the entire negotiation from Noah's perspective. The adults handled the rest. A week later, Julian called again. "We have an offer." "How much?" $650,000. I nearly dropped my phone. "I think you misunderstood." I didn't. I sat down at the kitchen table because my legs suddenly felt weak. Julian continued, "But I don't think we're accepting it." "What?" "There are 2 other collectors asking to see the painting." The private viewing was held on a quiet Tuesday morning. Julian had dimmed the lights and limited attendance because Noah struggled with noise. That's where I met Evelyn Shaw. She was in her 70s, elegant without looking flashy. The first thing she asked Julian wasn't about the painting. "Does the young man have somewhere quiet if this room becomes too much?" Julian nodded. "We've prepared an office upstairs." She smiled. "Good." She turned to Noah. "You don't owe anyone a conversation if you're tired." He blinked once. "Thank you." Later, I asked Julian if they knew each other. They've never met. Then how did she know? He hesitated. "I think she recognized something." The bidding didn't happen all at once. It stretched across several days. Another collector entered, then another. One represented a museum. One wanted exclusive exhibition rights. The local newspapers started noticing, then Chicago. By the end of the week, Julian called me while I was stocking greeting cards during my shift at Michael's. "Helen," his voice sounded almost amused. "I hope you're sitting down." "I can't. I'm working." The final bid came in. "Okay." "It's $2.3 million. For several seconds, I honestly thought I'd heard him wrong. I walked into the break room. "Julian?" "I've checked the paperwork 3 times. "How?" "A bidding war, exhibition rights, buyer premium, and one very determined collector." I leaned against the vending machine. I don't even know what to say. "Say congratulations." The local station WTHR aired a short feature. Noah agreed to answer exactly 3 questions. When the reporter asked how it felt to become famous overnight, Noah answered honestly, "I don't think buildings know they're famous." That clip spread faster than any interview could have. 2 days later, my phone rang. Richard. His name hadn't appeared on my screen in years. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered, "Helen!" His voice sounded warmer than I remembered. I always knew the kid had talent. I hung up. He called again. I blocked the number. Then came the text messages. "We need to talk about Noah's future. I've always wanted to reconnect. This money belongs in the family." A week later, Vanessa posted photographs online, calling Richard the proud father behind Indiana's newest artistic genius. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Proud father? The man who hadn't attended a single therapy meeting? Who couldn't remember Noah's birthday half the time? Then Richard appeared uninvited at Julian's gallery while reporters were setting up. He stood beside a large reproduction of Noah's painting. One reporter asked what medium Noah preferred. Richard smiled confidently. He mostly works with high-end oil-based coloring. Julian nearly choked, trying not to laugh. But Richard recovered quickly. He looked straight into the camera. "I've spent years respecting my son's privacy. Some people don't understand what that kind of sacrifice looks like." That line bothered me far more than the painting comment, because it sounded believable. Comments online started changing. Some people still called him a deadbeat father, others asked whether I'd pushed him away. Then Calvin Ross sent Margaret the legal petition, the adoption, the escrow, the request to review my handling of Noah's finances. Everything stopped. The trust couldn't be funded until the court ruled. Noah's college planning stalled because several legal documents required confirmation that no active dispute affected his financial authority before he turned 18. It wasn't just money anymore, it was his future. I stopped sleeping. Some nights I woke at 3 in the morning and sat in my car eating fast food fries because I didn't want Noah to hear me crying in the kitchen. One afternoon I caught myself looking at Vanessa's social media pictures. Perfect hair, perfect clothes, perfect smile. Then I looked at my own reflection in the laundry room mirror, gray roots, soft stomach, reading glasses hanging around my neck. I wondered whether Richard thought women like me became easier to intimidate because we'd spent so many years putting everyone else first. I didn't hear Noah walk in. He set a glass of water on top of the washing machine. I wiped my eyes. "I'm okay." He shook his head once. "No." I tried to smile anyway. "It's complicated." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "He left." A pause. "You didn't. That was all. No speech, no dramatic promise, just the truth." Later that evening, he walked into his room and returned, carrying an old external hard drive. He placed it on the kitchen table. "Dad talked around me," he said. I stared at the old external hard drive for a long time before I touched it. It looked ordinary. A scratched black case, a faded label with Noah's neat handwriting. Home. "That's everything?" I asked. "No," he said. "It's everything I thought might matter someday." I felt a chill, not because Noah had been secretly collecting evidence against his father, because I realized he had spent years preparing for the possibility that the man who abandoned him might come back. Margaret plugged the drive into her laptop. Folders appeared in perfect order. School. Medical, photos, voicemails, emails, legal. Every file had dates. Every recording had notes. Margaret looked at Noah. "When did you organize all this?" "I reorganize things when I'm anxious." It was such a Noah answer that none of us spoke for several seconds. Margaret opened the first folder. There were scanned emails Richard had sent years earlier. One read, "How soon after the adoption will my support obligation officially end?" Another, "If Helen adopts him, I won't have to keep signing school paperwork, correct?" Margaret clicked another file. Richard's voice filled the office. "I'm telling you, once those papers are signed, he's legally your responsibility." The recording stopped. Another one began. Richard laughed. "Best financial decision I ever made." I closed my eyes. I remembered exactly where he had been standing when he said it, the garage. He had no idea Noah was sitting inside the car with the window cracked open. Margaret continued opening files. There was the photograph from the Chase Bank conference room, Richard smiling, the notary standing beside him. Every page of the adoption papers spread neatly across the table, his initials visible on each one. There were Christmas texts between Richard and Vanessa joking about finally being free. A short home video where Richard toasted a new beginning while thanking Helen for saving 18 years of bills. Margaret leaned back. "This is very good," she paused, "but don't confuse good evidence with a guaranteed outcome." I frowned. "Why not?" "Because public opinion doesn't always follow facts." She was right. We learned that 2 days later. Richard's attorney filed something new. It wasn't about money this time. It was about me. Someone had been following me. The filing included photographs. One showed me struggling to climb the courthouse steps because my right knee had locked. Another showed me carrying takeout bags after leaving work. One caught me crying in my car. Another showed me sitting outside the therapy center with my head resting against the steering wheel. The filing described me as emotionally unstable, physically unhealthy, unable to manage the pressure of caring for Noah and overseeing millions of dollars. It was cruel. It was manipulative. And the worst part? It worked. Not legally, emotionally. That night, I stood in my bathroom wearing an old t-shirt and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the woman Richard married. Loose skin, gray hair, arthritic knees. I suddenly understood why he thought I would give up. People assume women become invisible after 50. Maybe Richard believed invisible women stopped fighting. The next afternoon, Margaret called. "There's something else." Her voice sounded unusually careful. "You should come in." When we arrived, Calvin Ross was already there with Richard. He placed a single envelope on the conference table. "My client recently recovered this among family belongings." Richard looked almost sorrowful. "It's from Claire." For a moment I couldn't breathe. Claire, Noah's mother. She had died before Noah turned 3. Margaret unfolded the handwritten letter carefully. I recognized the stationery immediately. Claire had once written grocery lists on paper like that. Margaret read silently, then handed it to me. Claire wrote that she hoped Richard would always remain the person responsible for protecting Noah's future. She thanked Helen, me, for loving Noah, but she also expressed hope that Richard would continue guiding their son as he grew older. My hands started shaking. It sounded like her, the careful language, the formal way she used Richard's full name whenever something mattered. I remembered reading other letters years earlier. This one fit, or at least I thought it did. "What if," I whispered. Margaret looked at me. "What if I misunderstood what Claire wanted?" No one answered. That silence hurt more than anything. Driving home, I cried harder than I had since Richard walked away. Had I held on to Noah because he needed me? Or because I couldn't bear losing another person after losing my marriage? For the first time in 12 years, I questioned myself. The story spread quickly. One Indianapolis website called it "Late Mother's Letter. May Change $1 million Art Dispute." Comments flooded in. Some called Richard a hero trying to honor his late wife. Others accused me of keeping a son from his real family. Someone slipped a folded note under my windshield wiper while I was inside my year. I unfolded it. "Give him back to his real family." Before I could hide it, Noah saw it. He stared at the paper. His breathing became shallow. "Can we go home?" He barely spoke that evening. He didn't paint. He didn't even turn on music. Around 9 o'clock, he knocked softly on my bedroom door. "Can I see the letter?" I handed him the scanned copy Margaret had emailed. He sat at the dining room table reading it for nearly 20 minutes. Line by line. Again, then once more. Finally, he looked up. "Something's wrong." "With what?" He pointed halfway down the page. She wrote that she hoped Dad would protect my future because of my sensory processing diagnosis. "So? I didn't have one." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I wasn't diagnosed until I was 5. Claire had died when Noah was 3. He continued reading. She also mentions my school accommodation plan. He looked at me. That didn't exist either. My heart started pounding. The room suddenly felt smaller. The next morning, Margaret refused to jump to conclusions. "It's suspicious," she admitted, "but suspicion isn't evidence." She contacted a forensic document examiner. She also hired a digital investigator. While we waited, another surprise arrived. My phone rang. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. No one spoke, but I heard voices in the background. Richard, Vanessa, they were arguing. "I told you this was going too far," Vanessa snapped. Richard answered sharply. "Then keep your mouth shut." "You said we'd pressure her." "We are." "You never said we'd drag Claire into this." "You like living in that house?" Silence. Then Richard spoke again. "Then stop complaining." The call disconnected. Apparently he'd pocket-dialed me without realizing it. I listened to the recording 3 more times. Something inside their marriage had started breaking. A few days later, Noah asked Julian to reserve the gallery for another exhibition. When he told me his idea, I felt a knot form in my stomach. "You're planning something?" "Yes." "For court?" "Yes." I looked directly at him. "Tell me the truth." He waited. "Are you doing this because you want justice?" I swallowed. "Or because you want him to hurt?" Noah didn't answer immediately. He stared down at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Both." Then he looked at me. "But I'm trying to make sure the first one wins." That was the moment I stopped seeing him as the frightened little boy under the kitchen table. Not because he'd stopped hurting, because he was honest enough to admit he hadn't. The following morning he called Julian. "I have another painting." Julian asked what it was called. Noah answered simply, "Consent." Then he added one more sentence. "It shows the part Dad says never happened." The invitation called it an evening of quiet places. That was Julian's idea. Not the $1 million painting. Not the Boy Genius exhibition. Just an evening of quiet places. The event would raise money for an Indianapolis nonprofit that helped teenagers with disabilities pursue careers in the arts. Noah agreed to unveil one new painting and allow a pre-recorded interview to play afterward. "No live questions," he told Julian. "None," Julian promised. The guest list stayed intentionally small. Collectors, a few local reporters, teachers, donors, people Julian trusted. It should have felt safe. Instead, our dining room turned into mission control. Margaret spread legal folders across the table while reviewing timelines with Julian. The digital investigator had finished tracing the forged letter back to Richard's laptop. The forensic handwriting expert had also completed her report. Everything looked promising, but Margaret kept reminding us of the same thing. "We're not trying this case in the gallery." "We know," I said. "We're building a record." She nodded. "Exactly." The gallery wasn't about humiliating Richard. It was about giving him another opportunity to tell the version of the story he wanted the public, and eventually the court, to believe. If he contradicted himself again, that contradiction would matter. The evening before the exhibition, Noah sat at the kitchen table adding tiny details to his newest painting. I stood behind him. "You don't have to do this." "I know." "We could let Margaret handle everything." "I know." I rested a hand lightly on the back of his chair. "You don't owe strangers the hardest day of your life." He kept painting. "I'm not showing them the hardest day." He looked over his shoulder. "I'm showing them the decision." There wasn't much I could say after that. The gallery smelled faintly of fresh paint, polished wood, and coffee. Julian had arranged the lights carefully. Nothing too bright, nothing flashing. Soft, instrumental music floated through the room. Near the entrance, a small sign asked visitors to silence their phones. For Noah. He arrived wearing the same charcoal jacket he'd worn to his school awards ceremony. He hated formal clothes. But he'd agreed because, in his words, people expect jackets at galleries. As soon as we walked inside, Evelyn Shaw crossed the room. She didn't hug Noah, she didn't gush over him, she simply smiled. I asked Julian where the quiet room is. Noah looked surprised. "You don't need it?" "I probably won't." She laughed softly. "But I like knowing it's there." Then she lowered her voice. "My grandson always wanted to know where the exits were first." Noah nodded once. "I understand." Evelyn didn't explain further. She didn't have to. For the first time all week, I saw Noah relax his shoulders. Richard arrived 20 minutes later. He looked better prepared than during the meeting at Margaret's office. His suit actually fit. Vanessa followed several steps behind him. She looked elegant, but she wasn't smiling, not once. Richard immediately found 2 reporters. "I've always been proud of Noah," he said. "I just wasn't given the chance to be part of his success." The words were carefully chosen, not dramatic, not emotional, calculated. He'd learned from the online reaction after his television interview. This time he sounded almost reasonable. Margaret quietly leaned toward me. "He's improving." I noticed. "That makes him more dangerous." The centerpiece of the exhibition remained covered beneath a dark cloth. Julian welcomed everyone. He spoke briefly about young artists and accessible creative spaces. Then one reporter raised a hand. "Mr. Mercer," she asked Richard, "you've claimed you didn't fully understand the adoption papers you signed years ago." Richard sighed heavily. "I was grieving." He paused. Helen kept turning pages and pointing to every place I needed to initial. I signed because I wanted the whole nightmare to end. Margaret didn't react, but I saw her write something in her notebook. Richard had just admitted that I'd shown him every page. that he'd initialed each one exactly as the bank records showed. He thought he was describing pressure. Instead, he'd confirmed the procedure. A few minutes later, Vanessa wandered toward Evelyn. "I've become quite interested in art lately," she said. Evelyn smiled politely. "Really? Oh, yes. Noah's work reminds me of postmodern realism with a hint of Picasso." Evelyn blinked. Then she answered with perfect calm. "Picasso wasn't a hint." A long pause. "He was a person." I nearly laughed out loud. Vanessa excused herself. Even Margaret smiled. The tension broke just long enough for everyone to breathe. Julian finally unveiled Noah's new painting. The title appeared on the wall, Consent. The room fell silent. It showed the Chase Bank conference room 12 years earlier. Richard sat at the table. A pen rested in his hand. Stacks of legal documents lay open before him. Behind him stood Vanessa, holding car keys. Across the table sat a younger version of me beside a frightened little boy. The clock on the wall read exactly 3:42. Every detail came from memory, photographs, and bank records. A reporter asked Richard what he thought. He forced a smile. "I taught Noah perspective." Noah looked at him. "You installed the downstairs bathroom door backward?" Several people laughed. Even Richard smiled, but only with his mouth. His eyes stayed cold. As the crowd dispersed, he walked close enough that only I could hear him. "You think this changes anything? It already has. You've made a mistake." Before I could answer, Julian called everyone together for Noah's recorded statement. Only Noah never made it to the microphone. 3 photographers arrived unexpectedly. Camera shutters clicked. People shifted closer. Someone bumped into him. The room became louder, too loud. I watched the color drain from his face. His breathing changed. He covered his ears. Then he walked quickly toward the back hallway. Nobody stopped him. I found him sitting on the floor inside the storage room. His hands trembled. "I thought I could stay." I sat beside him. "You stayed longer than you needed to." "I left. Before it became worse." He stared at the concrete floor. "I wanted to do this correctly." "You did." "I didn't even finish." I shook my head. Walking away before something breaks isn't failure. He looked at me. Slowly, the tension in his shoulders eased. "We recorded the interview." "I know." "Let's use that instead." He nodded. "I like plans." "So do I." Julian played Noah's pre-recorded message while we remained in the hallway. His calm voice echoed through the gallery. He spoke about architecture, memory, why ordinary places mattered, no mention of Richard, no accusations, just honesty. Afterward, applause filled the room, not loud, gentle, respectful. When we returned, I noticed Vanessa standing near Calvin Ross. She wasn't looking at Richard. She was whispering urgently. Calvin's face lost all expression. He asked one question. Vanessa answered. He glanced across the room toward Richard, then away again. Margaret saw it too. "They're cracking." Before I could ask what she meant, her phone vibrated. She read one message, then another. Her eyes widened slightly. "The investigator recovered something." "What?" "A deleted audio file." She looked directly at me. It was stored on Richard's laptop. My pulse quickened. "What is it?" Margaret slipped the phone into her purse. "We're not listening to it here." She paused. "But if it's what they think it is..." She looked across the gallery at Richard, who was smiling for another photograph. "This case just changed. Courtrooms are quieter than people imagine. Television teaches us to expect shouting, dramatic objections, and surprise witnesses bursting through the doors. The Hamilton County Superior Court wasn't like that. It smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. The air conditioning hummed overhead. Attorneys spoke in measured voices. Even the reporters waiting in the hallway kept their conversations low. The room didn't feel theatrical. It felt permanent. Richard arrived 10 minutes early with Calvin Ross. Vanessa came separately. That caught my attention immediately. For years, she had followed Richard into every room as if they shared one shadow. That morning, she chose a different seat. Margaret noticed it too. "Something changed," she whispered. "I hope you're right." She closed her notebook. No, I know I'm right. The judge entered and everyone stood. After the usual introductions, Calvin began. His presentation was polished. Richard, he argued, had been grieving when he signed away his parental rights. He had trusted Helen completely and hadn't understood the permanent consequences of the documents placed in front of him. Calvin never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He suggested that I had gradually isolated Noah, that I controlled every relationship, that I had encouraged a vulnerable teenager to sell artwork worth millions while positioning myself to benefit from it. Listening to him, I almost sounded like a criminal. I glanced toward Noah. He sat quietly beside his own attorney, who had been appointed to represent only Noah's interests. His headphones rested around his neck, but he wasn't wearing them. He looked nervous. Not frightened, focused. Margaret stood. She didn't begin with emotion. She began with dates. Your Honor, 12 years ago, Mr. Mercer voluntarily petitioned to terminate his parental rights. She displayed the notarized adoption documents, then the Chase Bank photograph. There sat Richard, smiling at the camera with every page spread neatly across the table. The judge studied the enlarged image. Margaret continued. This photograph was taken immediately after Mr. Mercer reviewed and initialed every page. Next came the retired bank employee who had notarized the signatures. She remembered the day clearly. I always watched people sign, she testified. That's my responsibility. Did anyone rush Mr. Mercer? No. Did he appear confused? No. Did he ask questions? Several. And were those questions answered? Yes. Richard stared at the witness table without blinking. Margaret wasn't finished. She played one voicemail. Richard's younger voice filled the courtroom. Once those papers are signed, he's legally your responsibility. Another recording followed. Best financial decision I ever made. No one reacted dramatically. No gasps, no shouting, just silence, the kind of silence that makes people stop taking notes. Margaret then introduced the trust documents. She explained that the proceeds from Noah's painting had never entered my personal accounts. An independent corporate trustee controlled every dollar. The trust could pay for Noah's education, medical care, housing, and future support. It could not simply hand money to me. So Mrs. Mercer cannot withdraw these funds for personal use? The judge asked. Correct. And Mr. Mercer? Also no. That answer seemed to surprise Richard. He leaned toward Calvin. They whispered urgently. Then Margaret turned toward the envelope containing Claire's supposed letter. The petitioner submitted this document as evidence. She waited. Our experts concluded it is fraudulent. Calvin stood immediately. Objection. Margaret nodded. I expected one. She called the forensic handwriting examiner. The expert explained the similarities between Vanessa's handwriting and the letter. Then came the digital investigator. He projected a timeline onto the courtroom screen. A recently created draft, metadata, a deleted file, purchase records for Specialty Fountain Pen Ink. Finally, the recovered audio recording. The judge listened through headphones first, then allowed portions to be played aloud. Richard's voice came through clearly. Slow down on the capital R. A pause. Claire crossed her T's lower than that. Vanessa answered quietly. I'm trying. Richard again. It only has to look convincing. The recording ended. The courtroom remained perfectly still. I looked toward Calvin. His face had changed. He rose slowly. Your Honor. He took a breath. My client did not inform me of the existence of this recording or the circumstances surrounding the preparation of that document. Another pause. I will need to discuss my continued representation. Richard grabbed Calvin's sleeve. You can't be serious. Calvin gently removed his arm. I am very serious. The judge called a short recess. People filed into the hallway. Reporters whispered into microphones. No cameras were allowed inside, but everyone already knew something important had happened. Richard cornered Vanessa near the drinking fountain. I couldn't hear every word, only fragments. You promised. Not my fault. Keep your mouth shut. Vanessa shook her head. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely frightened. When court resumed, Richard tried one last strategy. He claimed Vanessa had forged the letter without his knowledge, that she wanted to impress him, that he had believed it was authentic. Vanessa closed her eyes. Then she stood. Her attorney placed a hand lightly on her arm. She nodded. I'd like to respond. The judge allowed limited testimony. Vanessa didn't cry. She didn't apologize to me. She simply told the truth. Richard had brought Claire's unused stationery home years earlier. Richard bought the ink. Richard dictated the wording. Richard corrected her handwriting. When she hesitated, he told her Helen would settle before anyone investigated. And when I realized we could be caught, she said quietly, he told me I'd be the only one blamed. Richard stared at her in disbelief. You liar! She looked back at him. No. A long pause. I'm just speaking before you get the chance to rewrite this too. Margaret called one final witness. Noah. He walked carefully to the stand. His attorney remained nearby. Margaret didn't ask complicated questions. Instead, she handed Noah a written statement. Would you prefer that I read this? Yes, she began. Richard Mercer is my biological father. That is a fact. It is not the same as being the person who raised me. Margaret continued reading. The statement described occupational therapy appointments, school conferences, hospital visits, late-night fevers, science fairs, broken washing machines, electric bills. Ordinary days that build a family. Then came one sentence that made me grip the edge of my chair. He says he gave me talent. Helen gave me time. Talent without time would have stayed in a closet. I closed my eyes. After a moment, Margaret read the final paragraph. I wanted my father to feel embarrassed. I won't lie about that. But I want something more than that now. I want my future to stop depending on his choices. The judge looked toward Noah. Thank you. Nothing more. Nothing less. It was enough. Margaret stood one last time. Your Honor, Mr. Mercer has spent months trying to obtain authority over assets he could never personally control. She explained the structure of the irrevocable trust. Independent trustee, court oversight, restricted distributions, separate legal representation. The allegation that Mrs. Mercer engineered this adoption for financial gain fails on every level. The judge reviewed her notes. Then she spoke. The petition to reopen the adoption is denied. Richard lowered his head. The escrow restriction is lifted. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. The matter involving the forged document is referred to the appropriate prosecuting authority for review. She paused. The court also finds no evidence that Mrs. Mercer acted contrary to Noah Mercer's interests. Richard suddenly stood. You don't understand. The judge looked over her glasses. I understand that fatherhood is measured by responsibility long before it is measured by success. He slowly sat back down. Outside the courthouse, microphones appeared almost instantly. Richard pushed through reporters without answering questions. Vanessa left with her attorney. She never looked back. Evelyn Shaw stepped beside Noah. A reporter asked why she had paid so much for the painting. She smiled gently. My grandson was autistic. The crowd became quiet. He taught me that safe places deserve to be remembered. She glanced toward Noah. This painting did exactly that. Then she announced an additional donation to the nonprofit supporting young artists with disabilities. Not to me, not to Noah personally, to the next generation. One reporter turned to Noah. What would you like people to remember from today? He thought for a moment, then answered simply, my father wanted credit. He looked toward the courthouse doors. Now the record is accurate. As Richard climbed into a rideshare across the street, I noticed 2 suitcases beside him. For the first time in years, Vanessa wasn't getting into the same car. People like to imagine that winning in court feels like crossing a finish line. It doesn't. It feels more like walking out of a hospital after hearing the words you'd been praying for. You're relieved. You're grateful, but you're also exhausted in a way sleep can't fix. For weeks after the hearing, our lives stayed strangely unsettled. Reporters still called. Unknown numbers lit up my phone almost every day. A few online comments insisted I had manipulated Noah from the beginning. Some people apologized after the court documents became public. Others never changed their minds. I finally stopped reading them. Margaret told me something I wrote on a sticky note and kept beside the coffee maker. "Court orders settle legal disputes," she said. "They don't settle strangers." She was right. The anxiety didn't disappear because a judge ruled in our favor. Noah had trouble sleeping. He started checking the locks before going to bed. Sometimes I'd wake around 2 a.m. and hear footsteps in the hallway. I'd find him standing by the front window, looking out into the quiet neighborhood. "Everything okay?" I'd ask. He'd nod. "I'm making sure." He never explained what he was making sure of. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe neither of us could. Life gradually became ordinary again. Ordinary turned out to be exactly what we wanted. We didn't buy a mansion. We didn't move to another state. The first thing we paid for wasn't a luxury car. It was a new furnace. The old one sounded like it was arguing with itself every winter. After that, we repaired the porch railing that had leaned to one side for 3 years because I'd kept saying, "We'll do it next spring." Next spring finally arrived. The trust handled Noah's educational expenses exactly the way Margaret had explained. An independent trustee approved every distribution. Neither Noah nor I ever touched the money directly. That had always been the point. It wasn't supposed to make us rich. It was supposed to make Noah safe. For myself, I finally scheduled the knee replacement surgery I'd postponed twice because there was always something more urgent. The operation went well. Recovery was slower than I wanted. One afternoon I struggled across the living room with crutches while Noah watched from the kitchen. "You're putting too much weight on your left side," he said. "I know." "You'll make the other knee angry," I laughed. "Now my knees have emotions?" "They might." He paused. "You should follow directions better." I raised an eyebrow. "You once wore 2 left shoes to school." "I was 6. I'm 52. He considered that. Fair. It was one of those little conversations that would mean nothing to anyone else. To me, it meant everything. For the first time in months, we were teasing each other instead of discussing lawyers. Noah enrolled in a local college program focusing on illustration and architectural design. Living at home made more sense. He liked familiar routines. He knew which classroom lights bothered him and which coffee shop stayed quiet between 9 and 11 in the morning. Julian still represented his work, but Noah made one decision that surprised everyone. He refused to paint another version of the house after he left. Collectors asked. Journalists asked. One gallery even offered an enormous commission. Noah always gave the same answer. "I already finished that story." Instead, he started a new series. He called it Places That Stayed. The paintings were quieter. Our kitchen after the ceiling had been repaired. A nearly empty Target aisle early on a Tuesday morning. The waiting room at my physical therapist's office. A stack of library books beside 2 mugs of coffee. The hallway outside his occupational therapist's room. There was hope in those paintings. Not because terrible things had never happened, because life had continued anyway. Evelyn kept her promise. She helped establish a small grant program for young artists with disabilities. Nothing flashy, just practical support. Transportation vouchers, adaptive equipment, noise-canceling headphones, studio fees. One afternoon, she invited Noah and me to lunch in Indianapolis. Halfway through dessert, she finally told us why she'd understood him so quickly. "My grandson Ethan hated fluorescent lights," she said. "He'd map every exit before entering a building." She smiled softly. "He also believed buildings remembered people." Noah looked up. "He painted?" "A little." She folded her napkin. "He died at 19. The table stayed quiet. Then Noah reached into his backpack. He pulled out a small sketch. Not for sale, not for exhibition, just a drawing of sunlight falling across an empty hallway. He slid it toward Evelyn. "I think Ethan would have liked this." She looked at it for a long time before speaking. I think he would have too. About 4 months after the trial, a plain white envelope arrived in our mailbox, no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from Richard. He was living in a rented apartment in Greenwood. He admitted his construction business had collapsed. The foreclosure had gone through. Vanessa had divorced him. He never actually apologized. Instead, he wrote that seeing Noah become successful had forced him to realize everything he'd missed. He ended the letter with one sentence. I thought there would always be time to come back. I handed it to Noah. He read it once, nothing more. Do you want to keep it? I asked. He looked at the pages for another moment. Then he shook his head. Evidence and memories aren't the same thing. He walked over to the shredder beside my desk. The machine hummed quietly for a few seconds. That was the end of it. Neither of us said another word. One Sunday morning, almost a year after Richard walked into Margaret's office demanding money that had never belonged to him, I woke early and wandered into the kitchen. Sunlight spilled across the floor. The new furnace hummed almost silently. 2 coffee mugs sat on the table. Noah was painting. For a long time, I simply watched. Then I realized something. He wasn't painting from underneath the kitchen table anymore. He was painting from where he sat. The repaired ceiling above us was plain white now. No water stains, no cracks, no shadows hiding frightened children. Just light. People sometimes ask me whether I regret fighting Richard instead of settling. The honest answer is no. Not because we won. Because Noah learned something I wish every child and every parent could know. Family isn't the person who comes back after your life becomes valuable. Family is the person who quietly stays while everyone else is looking for a reason to leave. If you've ever had someone walk away and return only after life started going well, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Sometimes sharing those experiences reminds us that healing rarely happens all at once, but it does happen. Thank you for listening.